when it comes to design, like even the Smash Bros discussion I made with you earlier, where how do you create these characters? How do you create these dynamics? How do you make this game fun? For me, it's so ephemeral. I don't know how to envision in my head. If you told me to sit down and create like a fighter game or like a combat game, I wouldn't know where to start. Like it's such a thing.
Yeah. So one thing one of my leads told me is you can't design abilities as a combat designer in a vacuum.
Hmm.
Abilities need some form of opposition, and that opposition comes through enemies. So when you are designing an ability, a specific core ability, for an example, we look at the Blades of Chaos in God of War, right?
Yeah.
As you're designing that ability, consider what that opposition against it would be. Blades of Chaos, fire, right? You're able to kind of like combust enemies and into flames. What would be a good opposition to that? What would be a good opposition to fire? I'm asking you, right?
I would say water,
Water and ice.
ice.
The Hellwalkers are ice zombies in that game, right? You have to think of them both simultaneously as you're designing them. Designing abilities in a vacuum, you really can't validate that ability and if it's fun, that core ability that you have or that core mechanic. So consider always thinking of that ability and thinking of the enemy that you're designing with relation to it. How does it complement that? And then validate those two. Look at if this ability is fun to use, if it creates a sense of interplay. Look at that enemy behavior and try to gauge its loop. Is it fun
Yeah.
to fight against? Is it interactive? How can you set it up? Right? So yeah.
So what about okay, I'm gonna take this left field. I've been trying to play Pokemon Nuzlocke. All right. I have a Game Boy Advance SP. It's right here. And I kind of put an emerald and I saw like a YouTube video. I'm like, this looks super fun. Like for a game that I've tried to play 2 years ago again, at some point you get to like the Elite Four and you're like, what am I doing? It's the same game. Like I know exactly what's gonna happen. You can see through it. Like through the when you were a kid, you're like, this is the most fun ever. When you're a bit older, you can kind of see through what a time sink this is for a goal that's not clear. But the moment you introduce like a hardcore modality, all of a sudden, what was like a really boring fight or a really boring grind now has an element of risk to it. I think in other episodes I've talked about WoW hardcore because the idea that you can play an MMORPG and like just lose your character that you spend 5 days playing, trying to like level up, just makes that any boring interaction now has stakes to it.
Mm.
Is there an element of that when you're looking at combat design where like if there is like a the idea that you can lose your character, like the idea of consequence being much higher, does it make what was used to be basic design now much more fun because people are taking it way more seriously?
Yeah. So so this is in human nature, right? Like when we put ourselves at risk for a greater reward, our dopamine receptors will fire so quickly, right?
Oh yeah.
We will take that. We will do it, you know? It's like when you're bungee jumping, right? So there's a risk to it, but the reward to it is that high dopamine hit as you're falling to the ground, right? As you're getting pulled up. The same thing applies here when you're playing games where your attacks have a sense of risk to them. When you're holding a great sword that does high damage, the risk here is that the great sword is super heavy to pick up and your anticipation is incredibly high. When is the right time for you to gauge? When is the right time for you to initiate that attack? It's by gauging the distance from your enemy, right? So the right moment, the right time to initiate that risk is while that enemy is away from you, right? And by the time they arrive, your anticipation is already over and bang, you do that. And it's highly rewarding and you annihilate your enemy because the reward is so great. The damage is really high with the risk of you being vulnerable in anticipation.
Yeah.
So that creates a lot of meaningful choice in combat. It's meaningful. You're able to understand the nuances between the attacks that you're using, and you're able to also kind of understand the intent behind them, right? A friend of mine who is a technical combat designer told me this, and he said, Bader, I think 70%, I think of 70% utility in the combat systems that I make and 30% of the cool factor, right? So utility is like, okay, like in the context of a situation, what would be the most appropriate attack that I would use? What is the risk and what is the reward? And the other 30% is how cool this looks. It could be the same attack as the previous one, but it has a different animation to it and it looks cooler. And it's important to consider that cool factor too. So yeah, that's why risk and reward is important.